Thanks everyone for joining this IISS discussion meeting on the implications of chemical weapons use in Syria. This is part of our Manama Dialogue discussion series, a series of events both before and after the October 26-28 IIS Manama Dialogue. We're going to focus this session on what has been the repeated use of chemical weapons in the Syrian civil war. We're going to ask what it means for diplomacy, what it means for the civil war, what it means for regional security, and then more broadly for the future of warfare. The use of chemical weapons in Syria after agreements were made that at the time we thought were the solution begs the question, was that solution, that 2013 framework under which Syria acceded to the Chemical Weapons Convention and gave up most of its stockpile, is that all something that we now have to say goodbye to? And it begs the question, has chemical weapons use become normalized again? So joining me are three of my friends and very well-known experts on this subject. Mallory Stewart, to my right, is a principal member of the technical staff of Global Security Research and Analysis at Sandia National Labs. She's also a non-resident fellow in the WMD Nonproliferation and Security Program at the Stimson Center. Of key importance to this discussion is that she previously was a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Emerging Security Challenges and Defense Policy in the Bureau of Arms Control, Arms Verification and Compliance, where she worked on the Syria chemical weapons framework. Earlier this year, Mallory had a connection with IISS in that she co-authored an article in Survival. That article was about the legal legal analysis of the nuclear ban treaty. And originally I thought we could get her here to talk about that, but then somebody else talked about that, so I said, what's the next best thing we could talk about? And chemical weapons in Syria seemed to be a pretty good topic. To my left, Dr. Ariel Eli Levite is a non-resident senior fellow in the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I've known Eli for a long time, since when he was the Principal Deputy Director General for Policy at the Israeli Atomic Energy Commission. He knows a lot about nuclear weapons proliferation and more generally about various forms of WMD. And on my far right, Dr. Aaron Stein is a resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Rafik Hariri Center for the Middle East. He's a former doctoral fellow at the Geneva Center for Security Policy, and I first knew him when we both were in London, me at IISS, of course, and Aaron at RUSI. We're going to do this event today as a conversation. I'm going to pose questions, and later on you will pose questions as well. We're going to try to keep this to an hour, meeting the schedule, and I've got to run off afterwards somewhere. We are on the record. This is being recorded. It should be on our website by about tomorrow. And the last housekeeping note is that at 2:18 we may have to take a short pause as all of our cell phones go off. Now, to set the scene, let me just state some of the facts of the matter. On September 14th, 2013, Syria, Russia, and the United States signed this framework for elimination of Syrian chemical weapons. It called for the elimination of Syria's chemical weapons stockpiles, and it set a destruction deadline for 9 months later. Syria acceded to the Chemical Weapons Convention. As part of this, the OPCW drew up an implementation plan which started being put into operation in 2 weeks, and by October 5th, chemical weapons started to be destroyed. It was on a very fast pace. Not all deadlines, interim deadlines, were met, but by June 23, 2014, all of Syria's declared chemical weapons stockpiles had been removed from the country, put on ships for destruction, where in 42 days, teams from the United States, assisted by several other nations with logistical and diplomatic support, destroyed all the chemicals. Huge success. I was one of the cheerleaders for this. But the next year, the OPCW found traces of sarin and VX nerve agent at a military research site in Syria that had not been declared. And then in the next few years, there were several chemical weapons attacks, including the one in April 2017 when Syria bombed Khan Shaykhun with sarin. Russia supported Syria's claim that no, Syrian government didn't do that. They just had some conventional bombs that happened to hit some sarin stockpiles the rebels had. The next year, April 2018, earlier this year, there was a chemical weapons attack on Douma that killed at least 49 civilians. Seemed pretty clear to most of us who follow this that this was a Syrian government operation, but again, Syria and its supporters said no. So we're going to talk about that and what it all means. And I think I'd like to start with you, Mallory. You were involved in the Syrian framework, so I know that you're biased in this question, but was it a net positive and why?
First, thank you for having me.
And I'm sorry, use the microphone, so yeah.
Thank you for having me here.
Good.
I'm happy to be here to have this conversation. I am biased, so I will acknowledge that having worked on this for many years, I have to view it as a comparative success, realizing that there's arguments on both sides. But I think if you look at the framework operationally, it was the vehicle for the destruction of 1,300 tons of declared Syrian stockpile chemical weapons and precursors. Certainly, it allowed for Syria's accession to the Chemical Weapons Convention as one of the requirements of that framework cooperation. And upon entering the Chemical Weapons Convention, Syria was thus part of a framework for continual deterrence and hopefully eventual accountability. Now, as we know, best laid plans did not necessarily work out in this event, and there were continual uses, and there continue to be uses of both chlorine and sarin and other potential chemicals. However, my opinion is that the framework was a net positive because it allowed for several things. One, the continuing oversight of the Syrian regime, even if it was in the OPCW that you heard many countries criticize Syria, and specifically in that context, Assad's legitimacy was questioned repeatedly, and there was constant questions about the sufficiency and extensiveness of the Syrian declaration. It allowed for those conversations to continue and hopefully to get more information out of the Assad regime. There were edits and updates to the required declaration under the Chemical Weapons Convention, and it allowed this framework for continual digging into what Assad had. And I want to keep this short, but I also think the framework provided the theoretical possibility of using a strict treaty structure in a more creative way. We were able to use Article 4, Paragraph 8 and Article 5, Paragraph 10 that allowed for some flexibility when a party joined the convention after the 10 years required for chemical weapons destruction upon the entry into force. It allowed for the Executive Council, the OPCW, to provide oversight of that destruction process. And that hook gave us the legal mechanism to incorporate a new program, a new idea into the Chemical Weapons Convention, this new legal structure of binding destruction deadlines on a new member and an extensive oversight and verification regime that had never been seen before. So I think those were two net positives. Certainly happy to discuss some of the negatives, and we can have that conversation. But I would just start with the positives of the framework and also look forward to discussing with you whether the framework is continuing in some way to this day.
Okay, thanks very much, Mallory. I didn't structure this as a debate, so I didn't enlist somebody to say why it's a net negative. Ellie, if you are of that view, you're welcome to say so. But I also, and more importantly, I think, want to ask you to be a bit predictive. Do you think that Assad will use chemical weapons again? Who can stop him? And why don't they? What should be the international response to this repeated use? So any of those questions you'd like to pick up on, go at it.
Nobody would dare defy you, Mark, in light of the wisdom of your questions. So I would start with answering those and then just expand beyond them a little bit. I would say I would see no hesitation by Assad to use it again. He is technically able to do so based on remaining stockpiles, and the only country that can stop him is Russia. I don't see others having either the resolve, the perseverance, the interest, and so on in actually stopping them at this stage. Theoretically, the US might be able to do it. I don't think the US is actually willing to play the role. France would join in, but I don't think that the US and France together. And moreover, I think that any military intervention going forward would now run into serious problems with the Russian military deployed in Syria. So I would argue that that's out of the cards. But let me backtrack for a second. In a piece with George Perkovich, the day the idea was even floated, supported going for the deal. So I'm speaking from the vantage point of someone who thought that the deal represented an opportunity that, while not perfect, on balance was something worth having. I feel a fair amount disillusioned over time. Let me explain why. Not all of the arsenal were destroyed, and we're all living with that reality. Second, not all use was eliminated, neither in the past nor likely in the future. Third, the opportunity to seize on this and creating kind of moral repugnance against using chemical weapons was not taken advantage of over time, beyond the original opportunity that we thought. In fact, the banning just chemical weapons created the legitimacy to engage in other forms of mass destruction, as if if you use cluster bombs, that's fine, or whatever other barrel bombs you drop on cities. So what good does it make? These intimidate, those intimidate, and so on. Chemical Weapons Convention implementation, we now see that is something short of an ideal instrument that we hoped it would be. But let's go beyond this for a second. I think the biggest disillusion for me is the Russian role. I was initially sufficiently naive to believe that the US and Russia did have something in common, which was to really ban the stockpiling and use of chemical weapons. And that I thought that part of the motivation of the Russian was associated with that consideration. The other one was, of course, to save the Assad regime. I think their behavior over time had really made it abundantly clear that they have only one overriding consideration, which was to save the Assad regime. The moral republic did not exist, and if someone needed more proof of that, then the recent use of chemical agents by Russia in the UK, for example, just sent the message very powerfully home. I think the Russians are therefore the key pivot player, both in being an enabler of retention and use, but also potentially the instrument to ban future use and establish the norm. I think the Russians were a problem in terms of investigating the origins of the Syrian chemical weapons program. And I think all of this is going to come back to haunt us with the DPRK.
Thanks very much, Eli. I want to touch on the DPRK in a little bit. After, though, I pose a couple of questions to Aaron. Aaron, I'd like to ask your thoughts on what happened to the prohibitive use of chemical weapons, this norm that I, for one, thought had been put in place. And what does it mean that this norm has been broken? What does this mean for any future conflict contingencies in the Middle East, contingencies in which U.S. forces might be involved? And then maybe ask you also if you have any thoughts on can coercion or compellence or deterrence policies be effective in reinforcing the non-use norm?
Sure, and thank you for having me, and thank you everybody for coming. I want to start this by saying I agree with both of my previous two speakers here. A is when I heard about this potential chemical weapons deal, I was supportive of it. Two, I actually also agreed that there was possibility of U.S. and Russian overlap in interests to try and at least eliminate, remove, or control weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East. And I still remain in favor of the general idea of the deal, but I've also been disillusioned by the Russian role as well. And I say that for two reasons, and I think it gets to your point on future use and this prohibitive norm. First, I don't think there is a prohibitive norm against the use of chemical weapons in the Middle East. If you look back at the conflicts in which have taken place, sort of in the chemical era, everything since World War I, They have been frequently used. You can see Egypt and Yemen, you can see Iraq, and now you can see Syria. There's even allegations of them being used in Afghanistan. I mean, you can go across the line. And so these are a mechanism and a tool for a lot of these governments to fight wars, largely against their own people or cross-border insurgencies. And I think that is important as well, in that in the way that the Assad regime has used chemical weapons is textbook. He uses them to kill civilians and to kill combatants in urban areas in ways to offset his conventional military weakness. They are non-persistent agents in the case of sarin, and so it allows for him to augment his military capabilities, because we all know, we've all watched, that the Syrian armed forces aren't exactly top-notch. And so within that, the Russian role has been to sort of act as like a parachute over the top, in that both these questions of compellence and coercion, and by compellence, I basically say that that's the Obama-era approach of the threat of the stick, offering a carrot to accede to this deal, and then the Trump administration approach of coercion, which is if you use, we will strike you with cruise missiles, and we've demonstrated the ability to do so, or the willingness to do so, I should say, is that the Assad regime can calculate that the U.S. has a hard cap on how much force it can use. Because I think the primary fundamental change about the Syrian conflict is not the use of chemical weapons. It's the return of a Russian policy within the Middle East that they will not allow external regime change. And that's President Trump. Maybe I'll give 30 more seconds there. Is that good?
That's good.
Okay. And so they offer a cap. And so the Russians will not allow external regime change and will try and to enable its client in any way possible, up to and including the use of chemical weapons. That's A. B, and I think this is the more worrying aspect for U.S. policy in the future, is one, again, if you agree with me, and some people won't, that the prohibitive norm in the Middle East against chemical weapons is not as robust as it should be. Is you now have a Syrian regime that is a signatory to the Chemical Weapons Convention while holding stockpiles of chemical weapons and showing a willingness to use them. That further erodes that norm. Two, and this is separate, because there's a lot of allegations, false flag theories. I don't want that to be confused or anything along those lines. You have seen, beginning in 2003 with the U.S. invasion of Iraq as we move forward, and then continuing into the counter-ISIS wars both in Syria and Iraq, is non-state actors using chemical weapons. In this case, I'm talking about Islamic State. And so you're seeing a diffusion of the use of chemical weapons. Again, not to say that lend any credence to false flag or anything along those lines, but both the employment of chemical weapons by governments in a textbook way, and the relatively crude, but nevertheless, use of chemical weapons by non-state actors. And those are both implications for U.S. policy. One, on the normative side for the Chemical Weapons Convention, and general efforts to reduce and eliminate all classes of WMD. And two, in the more likely scenario where they could be employed against American forces, is at the non-state level. And so the next time American forces are deployed in the Middle East, because there will be a next time, you can no longer plan for a non-WMD contingency, even if the target is not a state actor.
Okay, thanks very much, Aaron. Let me have one more round of questions, then we'll go to the audience. But Mallory, let me start again with you, if I may. Both of the other panelists here have accused Russia of, as the reason for their disillusionment. When you were negotiating it, Russia was a partner, and do you feel a similar sense of disillusion? But also I wanted to ask, you're a legal expert, and do you see the framework as still having validity, and does it have any positive precedent setting value for any future arms control agreements, maybe with North Korea, for example?
Okay, yes. Those are two very complicated questions, but I think just from a personal perspective, certainly the framework would not have been successful without Russian cooperation, certainly. And the continuing decisions of the OPCW for the first 2 years after the framework would not have been possible without Russian cooperation. It was when the US and Russia could no longer cooperate because our objectives were no longer aligned, and I think that's a very legitimate comment made by the other two speakers, that forward progress on the Syrian file really stopped. And so there is a certain amount of disillusionment given the strong words and commitments made in the framework and in the subsequent OPCW documents that all use needed to have accountability follow. Those were statements made by both the parties to the framework, but also by the OPCW Executive Council several times. So all 41 states of the Executive Council would agree that any use of chemical weapons by anyone need to result in some measures of accountability, and that didn't happen. Certainly Russia was a large factor in that, and they did not see the continuation of all of the mechanisms set up under the framework's auspices of fact-finding missions, declaration assessment team, even the JIM, the Joint Investigative Mechanism, was no longer in Russia's interest, certainly because it was coming out with measures that demonstrated Assad was responsible for the use of chemical weapons, and measures that would ultimately, hopefully, and the intent was to lead to accountability, and so that's when the cooperation ceased. So certainly, not ever thinking that when a country's interests diverged that they would necessarily stay the course because they had committed to accountability. I think there was a hope that the alignment of U.S. and Russian interests in the Syrian conflict would stay longer than they did. And so realizing that they didn't stay as long as needed to actually have some accountability or in any way minimize the horrible humanitarian effects of the Syrian conflict. As for your second question, I think the framework laid the groundwork for much of the subsequent developments in the OPCW context, certainly allowing the creativity to develop the fact-finding mission, allowing the authorities and sort of justification for the development of the declaration assessment team in the OPCW, even leading at some level to a discussion of the JIM. I mean, the same countries that were agonizing in the OPCW context as to how to get to accountability realized the need for a JIM to allow some type of attribution mechanism when the OPCW at that time could not itself declare that the helicopters dropping chemical weapons were clearly Assad's helicopters. So I think it's continuing in that it allows that flexibility and that demand for action. Certainly disappointment across the board on insufficient action under the framework, but it also set the stage for a demonstration that international cooperation could achieve results. And international cooperation that nobody expected would be successful, the US and Russia coming together on the Syrian conflict, was extremely successful initially and diminishingly successful, and yet encouraged the broader OPCW community to get involved. And so you did see the evolution from a consensus-based community to a vote process as those that had been inspired by some method to get to accountability realized that there had to be some consequences for the use. Now, I agree with the other two speakers that it does diminish the Chemical Weapons Convention the longer a state party is allowed to continue to use or to have confirmed its past use without any consequences. It diminishes both the Chemical Weapons Convention and all of international law. And certainly it diminished any effort that the OPCW engaged in to try to seek accountability. So that is one of the big drawbacks of having taken these efforts. However, we didn't get to the background context of the framework's development. There weren't very many good options. And I think we've seen subsequently there aren't great options for addressing this without Russia taking the lead or a more active involvement by the rest of the world. So I've spoken too long, but I can talk about the framework as a model for future engagement just very quickly, in that it does say if you have an international community coming together using legal documents, both the UN and non-bindings in a creative manner, you can actually achieve much more than just possible under a black and white letter law of a treaty. And so I think that is a model for future engagement in WMD conversations, is certainly in the absence of additional treaties in this realm.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Mallory. Ellie, the last words you said in your initial presentation was focusing on the enabler, Russia as the enabler. And then you mentioned a DPRK role. And I thought the next sentence was going to be, and the Iran role. And if you talk about Iran's role in this town, you'll get a lot of heads nodding positively, and I expect in Israel as well. But I'm kind of wondering why you didn't, or should we think of Iran as also enabling Syria's use of chemical weapons? And what else can you say about the DPRK role?
Well, you don't expect me to say too many kind things about the role Iran is playing in Syria. That being said, I think on the chemical weapons front, I hold the Russians primarily accountable for being the enabler, as well as kind of blowing the opportunity or the trust we've had in kind of an agreement where the Russians initially were facilitating an agreement that was potentially very positive and then causing us the disillusionment and so on. By the way, we should also acknowledge, I think Mallory was referring to the role of some of others who were very constructive in the engagement around Syria, France being a very prominent case in point, not just in the past in terms of the willingness to use military force, but also in the role they played in the diplomacy of the OPCW. But we go beyond this. So I don't hold the Iranians to be particular culprits in the use of chemical weapons or in the provision of technology and so on. Clearly, in terms of some of the fighting in Syria and what they're and keeping Assad regime in place and just standing in the way of upholding some standards of accountability and so on, Iran is anything but helpful. But okay. Let me go to the DPRK. I was actually thinking about the DPRK mostly in the context of it's the next big case. It's the next big case. Number one, presumably we're committed to denuclearizing the DPRK. Are we also committing to ridding them of chemical weapons? Number one. Number two, would the Russians assist in that process or complicated it? Would the process not just deprive them of the existing chemical weapons, but also prevent them from transferring those capabilities to somebody else in the process for financial gain or some other type of benefits and so on? Would the process now establish a benchmark that you're not only going after the existing stocks, but you actually probe a bit deeper how they actually managed to put their hands on such a stock? Who was assisting them in the process? And all I wanted to say was, if this is the next, so we have one anywhere between imperfect or disillusioning case in the name of Syria. We now have negotiations coming up in the DPRK, which provide us in some way another opportunity to say, do we really care about chemical weapons? Do we care about them even more when someone is being deprived of their nuclear weapons and might try to offset the nuclear weapons that it gives up, if it ever gives them up, by building up on the chemical weapons capability? So that was the context in which...
Okay.
And the last point that I would make is the following. To me, the most shocking aspect, and I'm talking as someone who does come from the Middle East, but thinks of himself as wedded to a more kind of the liberal traditions, that you see both in Syria and in Russia, the use of chemical weapons primarily as weapons of intimidation against civilians. That there are some people who believe that particularly gruesome, visible forms of killing are actually quite expedient. That was true with the polonium, and that was true with the Novichok. That is a really frightening notion.
Yeah, sorry, I just focusing on that last point leaves me a little speechless right now. Aaron, I was going to ask you, here, hold the mic, to follow up on your point that Assad used these weapons to compensate for military deficiencies that this gave him a capability that he was able to employ that he wouldn't otherwise have been able to achieve some outcome. And Ellie referred to it as chemical weapons are a form of intimidation against civilians that can be particularly gruesome and frightening. Would you agree that without chemical weapons, Assad could not have progressed the civil war as successfully as he has?
I mean, that's a good question. And let me start by saying, because this actually builds on a piece I wrote for War on the Rocks a couple weeks ago with Luke O'Brien about, because we often focus on like the legal mechanisms or the prohibitive normative lessons about why chemical weapons should not be used, we forget about why they were used in the first place and why they are actually, in certain cases, effective battlefield weapons. And so I have some stats here. So if you have, an unguided munition like the Syrian regime uses, it can take greater than 147, 155 millimeter artillery shells to destroy a moderately sized structure. And if people move into basements, most of those people will live. It will be manifestly unpleasant, it will be loud, you will feel vibrations, but you will survive. If you're fighting in an urban area where there are lots of basements, this is a good way to take shelter. We've seen this in urban insurgencies everywhere. Chemical weapons, and this is according to a UN report written on the use of chemical weapons and bacteriological weapons, written in 1969, costs $600 more or less at that time to generate one civilian casualty per square kilometer, as opposed to $2,000 US to generate one civilian casualty per square kilometer. They're cheaper weapons to use. We think of them as prohibitively expensive. That's the upfront costs. Once they are developed, they have a use. And the use of sarin, it's non-persistent, so troops can move in afterwards. Assad and the Russians have escalation dominance over the opposition, the rebels, the insurgents, whatever you call them. And so they are able to deliver mass firepower on the conventional side that will offset anything that could be provided to the opposition. With a caveat, in the urban areas, as I said, that triggers the tactical advantage to the insurgent, even though they cluster. And if you are willing to destroy a city, you can kill everybody in that city. The question is, how many people do you want to lose on your side as you fight for that city? And if you have manpower shortages, which is what the Assad regime does have, chemical weapons become a very, very convenient way to clear city blocks, or smaller, areas within cities, pockets. And so I do not find it, abnormal to use these weapons at the last stages of retaking an urban area. And to speak to the horrors of chemical weapons, the Iranian role here is that we have a lot of psychological data on PTSD from chemical weapons use, both on the Iranian side and the Iraqi Kurdish side. I can't cite the specific figures, but because I can't remember them off the top of my head, but rates of PTSD amongst survivors of the Iran-Iraq War and then the 1988 use of chemical weapons in Halabja against the Iraqi Kurds show that rates of PTSD are far higher to those that were exposed to chemical weapons than those that were just exposed to conventional weapons. And so if you are looking to terrorize a civilian population, again, it makes sense. Now, this isn't how the United States would fight a war, but this is how the Syrian regime would fight a war. Okay. And so it all makes sense.
All right, well, that's you both ended on rather gruesome thoughts there. Let's turn to the audience, and in the usual way, catch my eye, wait for the microphone to be passed. I'm going to first turn to Terry Taylor in the fifth row, if you'll bring him the microphone. Then state your name again for the record and pose a comment or a question and points for brevity.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the insights. I'm going to challenge some of the points, particularly this last point. from a technical point of view, put aside the political definition of weapons of mass destruction, I find it hard, from my own experience, to describe chemical weapons as a weapon of mass destruction. I know the political background. I'm fully aware of that. I was involved in the negotiations of the Chemical Weapons Convention. I'm a great supporter of it. But I would challenge the idea, if you will look at the number of casualties in the international armed conflict, not civil war, and that was another point I wanted to raise, in Syria, there are at least 6 countries involved, that if you look at the actual number of casualties that are attributed to the use of chemical weapons, they're very small in comparison with the over 500,000 that were killed by other means. So I think some of the problems have been, and I'd like to hear views about this, is we have to be careful not to overstate it. The Chemical Weapons Convention is invaluable, and the fact that they are being used as being challenged is the treaty working, not the treaty not working. It's the treaty working. It's the same with North Korea. Out of the NPT, some say, well, the treaty doesn't work. That's the treaty working. They breached the rules of the convention. So just to return to the point about, because I think there's a danger of disappointment and there's a danger of ignoring the other hideous breaches of the laws of armed conflict, attacks on hospitals, attacking the civilians when they come out to get food in markets. This is all part of the Assad thing, and the chemical weapons are part of that, but only part of it. So I'm just trying to call for a sense of proportion. Thank you.
Thanks, Terry. I'll take another comment. I do note that Ellie did make this point in his presentation too, that it kind of legitimized the cluster bombs and the other forms. Can I ask in the front row here, please?
Hi, my name is Simone Williams. So based on the discussion, if chemical weapons is becoming, if it makes sense, the utility for the use of chemical weapons in the Middle East, but outside the international community has the prohibitive norm against them, how do we expand that prohibitive norm to the Middle East to continue to enforce and restrain the use of chemical weapons?
Okay, thanks for that. Let's hold that question. Let me get one more comment, Harlan, and then I'll get you next.
I'm Harlan Ullman with the Atlantic Council and the Naval War College. I'd like to make this discussion more forward-thinking because it's been largely retroactive. In this context, in 1924, Churchill decided to pull the British Army out of Mesopotamia and turn the war over to the RAF, who used poison gas, as you well know. Given the explosion of technology, it is not inconceivable tomorrow to be able to clone mosquitoes or some other medium, which over a set period, say of a week or two, could infect large numbers of people with cases that would be more serious than the flu, that would be entirely incapacitating. So for example, in Idlib, go back to 1924, instead of using poison gas, I'm now spreading the flu or some other kind of non-lethal element that can disable. How do we take that on in the future in terms of conventions? Because this plays on all sides, and quite frankly, as I said, with the explosion of technology and DNA theory, this can be done in high school laboratories.
I'm going to take one more. Thanks, Harlan. Josh Pollock over here in the end of the third row.
Thanks, Mark. Mallory, you talked about the opportunity to use the treaty structures creatively. My question is, why not use it as written? In particular, why were the challenge inspection provisions of the Chemical Weapons Convention not brought to bear? Why instead did we have the GIM and so forth?
Okay, good. Let's turn back to the panelists. We got four important points here. Are we overstating the issue by focusing on chemical weapons and sometimes according it a WMD status that is not deserved? How do we restore the norm against chemical weapons use? What about the explosive expansion of other technologies that might be much more devastating? And what about the challenge inspection provision of the Chemical Weapons Convention? Any of you want to take on any of those? Who wants to go first? Okay, Aaron, you can go first. And you don't have to deal with all of them, of course.
Well, just on the first one, as chemical weapons as WMD, I actually completely agree with you. I went to the Middlebury Institute of International Studies for my MA, so there's a few people here. And that was always one of the challenges with the background in nuclear weapons is the three in one category. And because there's really one, and then there's the second, which I would do chemical weapons, then I do biological really beneath those in terms of lethality. And in terms of destroying city blocks, the Assad regime did just fine with conventional artillery and bombs built, and airplanes built in the 1960s. So he did fine without it. My point about chemical weapons is that at the end of conflicts, when he was trying to retake urban areas for a specific mission set to seep into basements, just like the Iraqis, they made sense, especially if he had made the conclusion that external intervention, both in the Obama administration and even in the Trump administration, would be tolerable. I don't know what the last TLAM strike was, like 150 tomahawks. I mean, that's nothing to sniff at, but cost comparative to his ability to retake his country, it's 150 tomahawks, and he's in power. In terms of reestablishing the prohibitive norm, I would actually just go back to the comment, the first general. I actually also agree with that, is that the Russian obfuscation, the Syrian lying, is indicative that they're slightly ashamed of the use of chemical weapons. And so while I do say that there's no prohibitive norm, that really governs, really hard governs against their use, people are ashamed enough to try and hide it. And so we're moving in the right direction. I know that's not a satisfactory answer. In terms of forward thinking on the next generation challenges, I honestly have no idea.
Okay. Mallory, one of the questions was posed to you directly, and if you want to take up any other points.
Sure. So I'll just take the challenge inspection first. There's obviously a lot of politics around allowing the use of provision that could then become sort of a battle between parties, just go back and forth challenging each other. And so there was some hesitance all along to utilize the challenge inspection provision since the beginning of the Chemical Weapons Convention, and sort of starting that tit for tat or allowing a mechanism that allows for a huge amount of bureaucracy behind it to sort of tank the functioning of the Chemical Weapons Convention. But it was certainly something that was considered throughout the process. Do we just allow a challenge inspection to get at all the declaration inconsistencies, right? Because we are struggling with that. And when I said use the treaty flexibly, I certainly meant use the hard law of the treaty, right? It happened to have provisions in the treaty that allowed for future flexibility with the accession of Syria. However, there was no model in the treaty to allow for those specific mechanisms, right? So the OPCW had to dig down into its existing authorities to justify developing the fact-finding mission, to justify developing the declaration assessment team. Even subsequent mechanisms they've developed, they had to use existing authority under the Chemical Weapons Convention, but it hadn't really been articulated, nor had it been sort of fleshed out yet. And so they really pushed the boundaries of what they could do under the convention. And that's sort of what I think was eye-opening about the process. Again, the challenge inspection is politicized, unfortunately, but I think one day it may be used, and we could see. I think we are hoping for other countries to accede to the Chemical Weapons Convention. I'm certainly aware that the challenge inspection is one of the concerning elements of the Chemical Weapons Convention. So again, politics and sort of political concerns play a factor in not utilizing that, but it's on the list of tools that could be used. That was probably too long of an answer, but I wanted to go to overstating, because I think that's something I've heard a lot too, in that I care deeply about sort of all uses of weapons, but certainly my background is in a discussion, certainly legally, of chemical weapons and biological weapons. And when I discuss them, I'm mindful that there are other weapons equally as, if not more, harmful and used certainly more regularly. But I don't think setting up a structure to try to address chemical weapons and using it as another factor of delegitimizing this persistent Syrian regime in any way negates the fact that he has used cluster munitions in opposition of what the UN repeatedly tells him. And he has bombed hospitals, and he violates humanitarian law repeatedly. So I certainly think recognizing a violation of his Chemical Weapons Convention obligations does not undervalue the fact that he's violating a lot of other laws and doing a lot of other really bad stuff with other horrible weapons. Just to go to the explosion of technology, I think there's some, and I'm glad you raised it because there is one that would both implicate chemical weapons potentially and the Biological Weapons Convention, right? Because you're using biology. But I think there's some concern with the existing treaty structure that we're locked in some way. And that's what I hope can be sort of exploded beyond the traditional thinking, right? We've seen a problem in enforcing the Chemical Weapons Convention against the use of chlorine because there was at least a low level, if not approaching government level of confusion in certain arenas that because it wasn't on the listed chemicals at the back of the Chemical Weapons Convention, that it somehow wasn't covered. Well, that's just wrong. But unfortunately, when you have a treaty that has listings of chemicals, if you don't go through and think about it and realize that chlorine was one of the original chemical weapons that led to the negotiation and the concern about chemical weapons in the Geneva Protocol, you can maybe be confused by those categories of chemicals in the back that are covered for the purposes of verification. And so when you say there is emerging technology, I agree, I certainly agree, and it's stuff that we can't even conceive of. But under the Chemical Weapons Convention, anytime you use any chemical to incapacitate or harm, you are potentially coming into the realm of the Chemical Weapons Convention. The Biological Convention has a little more ambiguity on some of its definitions. It's not as potentially clear on certainly any sort of verification regime, but it has, again, a broad definition of when it would apply. And so you could say the Chemical Weapons Convention would apply if we're using a chemical to harm another or incapacitate another in that way, that would potentially implicate the Chemical Weapons Convention. The problem is, how do you enforce it? How do you verify it? How do you get into the showing that there is some sort of accountability for violations? And that is a problem that we have across the board with these conventions. But I do think we have to become more flexible in utilizing existing mechanisms and creating new mechanisms to address growing technology. And then finally, just the norm development. I think it's the standard, deterrence models of demonstrating it's not actually beneficial, and the conversation about how it will delegitimize the governments, and ultimately there have to be consequences for use, and that's how you can prevent, hopefully, future uses. When there's an assured conviction that upon using chemical weapons, you will lose legitimacy as a government and potentially, or as any sort of organized entity, and potentially lose the authority that you hope to achieve and the advantages you hope to gain by that use.
Okay, thanks, Mallory. Eli, you have anything you'd like to add to those?
I'll do it very briefly because I want to touch on a few points. Terry, I would make one point with respect to the efficacy of chemical weapons. If you think of them, and not just in terms of how bang for the buck in terms of killing, but intimidation, we're in a different league. And I think we have seen that very, very powerfully in Syria. With all due respect, I guess we differ. I would make a case for incorporating chemical weapons alongside nuclear weapons in the WMD category for two reasons. I would argue that both have been used for intimidation. And the big difference is that nuclear weapons haven't been used since Hiroshima, and chemical weapons are being used. So I think that an effort to try and disaggregate them is not particularly helpful, not to mention the fact that there are a lot of literature that I had seen coming from different parts of the world says they are an intermediate category. If you can't have nuclear weapons, what you should have is super chemical weapons and more effective chemical weapons. And Syria has been a clear case in point of trying to develop them, but that's far from being the only one. The strong point to be made is we're not dealing here just with the Middle East. I think the point we're trying to make here is that whereas the test has been in Syria, Syria has been merely the most blatant challenge of something which is much more profound, not just confined to chemical weapons, but even the chemical weapons. Shall we recall the theater in Moscow? And so on. So we have here a much more profound problem of these repeated challenges, some of them hiding under the clauses of how do you interpret chemical weapons and its prohibitions and so on. And clearly the Russians were already differing with us there. But I think what worries me the most is that what we're seeing in terms of our attitude to chemical weapons is reminiscent of the way they've used the little green man in Ukraine. There is more than one truth. This has a chilling effect wherever it's used, inside the chemical weapons context and beyond the chemical weapons context. And I don't want to go much further in terms of alluding to what I have in mind. Let me say just last two things. One is the biological agents. I had looked at this issue, including very recently. There is clearly some disconcerting potential there. I don't think that things are as worrisome as usual. In order to really make it militarily usable on a significant scale, no high school, no college, and so on, to have predictable and discriminating effects. If you really want to have, to knock off somebody with a biological agent, you were able to do it before and you can still do it now. Are some of the trends disconcerting? Yes, they are. Could biological developments that are designed to help with medicine and therapeutics and other things and so on be abused? Yes, I agree. They could. And that's something to monitor. But I think the fundamental issue is the following. All of the treaties, the multilateral treaties, are now under duress. The problem we're seeing with INF are quite telling. It's not confined just to the Chemical Weapons Convention. The problems we're seeing with the NPT. So the question is, can we devise some more creative instruments, not in lieu of those conventions, but I am not hopeful that we will be able to build new conventions that would be any more effective, that would still consolidate the norm against use, stockpiling, and so on. And here I'd love to work with Mallory and others in trying to develop those instruments. I have some in mind, but then we can talk about those.
Thanks very much, Eli. Okay, I think we have time for a lightning round. So speed dating, questions 15 seconds or less, answers 30 seconds or less. Start with Christina, then the gentleman in the fourth row, then the gentleman at the end here. And was there one, oh, I'm sorry, the woman back there, okay.
Just today, Russia announced that it has in fact deployed the S-300 defense missile system in Syria, which as of yesterday I was predicting would be a red line for the US, as previous red lines have also been crossed. I wonder your thoughts, Mallory and Ellie in particular, on that and the implications thereof on the ability for the Russians and indeed potentially the Iranians as well to be more willing to further engage in chemical weapons attacks in Idlib in particular, particularly, again, given what's going on with Iran and the sanctions regimes now as well, as a potential retaliatory measure.
Okay, gentleman in fourth row, thank you.
Thank you. I was just wondering if...
Name, please.
So my name's Tamim Khallaf. I was just wondering if the current developments in Syria can serve as a catalyst or some sort of a catalyst for the establishment of a regional arrangement for the elimination of weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East. I mean, this has been an issue which has been occasionally raised, and quite frankly, despite the outcry that exists internationally about the use of chemical weapons in Syria, the attempts to establish a zone, for example, of weapons of mass destruction, free of weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East, hasn't really received the amount of attention, I think, or the impetus or importance that it deserves. So I was wondering if there's a dichotomy of discourse in this section. Thank you.
Thank you. Last row here, Patrick. Last row.
Hi, Patrick Park. I'm a journalist with the Voice of America. Just one simple question relating to North Korea. We know that North Korea is deeply involved in the proliferation of weapons in Syria in the past. So at current stage, how significant is North Korea's presence and its role in the region today? Thank you.
Okay, and pass the microphone to the woman in the sixth row there, and I think, I'm sorry, that's going to have to be at Ken.
My name is Ingeborg Denissen. In June this year, the Convention of State Parties of the OPCW adopted a decision expanding its mandate on accountability, and I wonder how what do you expect from that? How do you assess it? Thank you.
Okay, good. Short questions. We're going to have short answers about the S-300 catalyst for Middle East zone weapons, WMD-free zone, role of North Korea in the Middle East, and OPCW role expansion. Let's maybe go in reverse order. Ellie, why don't you go first? And is that all right?
Okay. S-300 is merely one element of the Russian umbrella over Syria, electronic warfare, of different types and other types of air defense and so on are all in place, which would be significant challenge both in terms of discriminating between Russian assets and others, the threat to US or other capabilities that are being deployed against Syria if they were to be deployed, and also retarding the efficacy. So I think military strikes, even where they happen, would be they were problematic before, now they would be hair-raising. I'm not saying one should not do it, but the problem we have is, would this be a catalyst for Assad to use chemical weapons again? But quite possibly, unfortunately. And the other only point I would make is with respect to the weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East. I think it has, what we have seen is actually achieved the opposite result, saying the world is not committed to eliminating weapons of mass destruction, neither use nor elimination, and therefore anyone who has those capabilities better keep on to them because the world ain't going to bail them out through whatever instruments are out there.
Okay, thank you very much, Ali. Aaron.
Just quickly on the S-300. I mean, I don't, as Ali said, the thing is who is going to operate it, and I assume it's going to be Russians. And that's always been the complicating factor, is who's actually on the ground. So as your munition hits somebody, you don't want to hit Russians. We saw this, leaked quite prominently to the New York Times the last time the U.S. was considering a strike. So if I was the Israeli Air Force or the American Air Force, your rules of engagement become pretty tight in terms of what you can hit. But they were already tight. So I actually don't see it as a major game changer because they already have an S-400 and it's operated by the Russians. So I don't think it gives any more green light to forces on the ground to do more. It just adds more uncertainty to a war with 8 different players. I also think the iterative process of first the nuclear free zone in the Middle East, now the all-encompassing WMD free zone in the Middle East, has been one of the reasons why that prohibitive norm that I talk about is not as robust as I would like it to be. It's allowed for, I think we're going on 40 years of debate now about what classes of weapons to include, how to bring in how to address the Israeli issue, and then linkages between Israel and Palestine. And so all of those things, just keep cycling through debates. Nothing really gets resolved, and in the interim, people stockpile chemical weapons and use them.
So I'll quickly touch on the expansion of the OPCW Director General's capacity to get to attribution, which is a huge positive in my opinion. I think it was something that we had hoped the OPCW Director General could do throughout when there was confirmed reporting by the fact-finding mission that helicopters were dropping chemical weapons as early as 2014. So hopefully this will help, but I am cautiously optimistic at best, only because of the political circumstances the OPCW faces and the extreme pressures that the Director General, any Director General, has to navigate to maintain neutrality in a context in which, again, fake news, political pressures, and other reasons force accusations of non-neutrality when the Director General takes a position. So I'm hopefully positive, but not that optimistic. On the other points, I think the other speakers covered them quite well, except for the DPRK role in the region, which I just think is the DPRK sells to whomever will buy their terrible stuff. And I think Syria will buy their stuff, and so they continue to sell and to provide capacities. And then one final point, just because I have the last mic, I guess, is the connection between the nuclear ban treaty and the Chemical Weapons Convention, which I hadn't seen prior to writing that article, is interesting to me in that so many of the countries that are pushing for a complete ban in the nuclear context did not take any action or take any positive steps to hold Syria accountable when there was the confirmed use of chemical weapons under the chemical weapons ban. And so that, in my mind, challenges their sort of support for the nuclear ban treaty when they cannot demonstrate a commitment to prevent or to actually hold users of chemical weapons accountable under the Chemical Weapons Convention. So that's the connection I see tying to the TPNW.
Yeah, thanks very much. That's a very good connection. I was going to say that on the North Korea point, as Ellie suggested, that North Korea should have its chemical weapons removed as part of any process. And the Secretary of State has made clear that that's also the U.S. government position. So the word denuclearization isn't the best word. I tried to coin the term WMDization, but Terry is shaking his head no, not just for semantic reasons. So we'll have to come up with another term. Thank you very much for coming, for posing good questions, for engaging in a good discussion. Please join me in thanking panelists for a fascinating discussion. Thanks very much.